The small town of Pine Grove hadn't changed much in the past decade. Nestled between rolling hills and endless farmland, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at its own unhurried pace. At the heart of this community was the Anderson family farm, where their youngest son had just returned home after being away for 6 years. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty driveway as he pulled up in his old pickup truck. His father's weathered hands trembled slightly as they embraced for the first time since he'd left. No words were needed, the quiet understanding between them spoke volumes. His mother wiped tears from her eyes as she took in the sight of her boy, now a man with eyes that had seen more than she could imagine. To the outside world, he was just another farmer's son who had gone away and come back to help with the family business. Nobody in town knew where he'd really been or what he'd done during those years. He preferred it that way. The calloused hands that now tended to the crops had once gripped weapons in far-off lands. The eyes that watched over the sheep had kept vigil in the world's most dangerous places. But here, he was simply the quiet young man who worked from sunrise to sunset, keeping to himself. The local diner became his Saturday morning routine, a small concession to having a social life. He'd sit in the corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee while reading the newspaper. The regulars knew better than to disturb him, respecting his desire for solitude. But everything changed the day the Thunder Raiders Motorcycle Club rolled into town. They arrived in a roaring parade of chrome and leather, their motorcycles echoing off the storefronts of Main Street. The leader, a towering man with a graying beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, had chosen Pine Grove as their latest stopover. The group had a reputation that preceded them, not exactly troublemakers, but not the kind of people you'd want to cross either. That Saturday morning, the diner's peaceful atmosphere was shattered by their arrival. The bikers filled the small space with their boisterous laughter and loud conversations, claiming tables as if they owned the place. The waitress, a kind-hearted woman in her 50s, tried her best to keep up with their demands while maintaining her composure. The farmer's son sat quietly in his corner, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper. But old habits died hard. He was aware of every movement, every conversation, every subtle shift in the room's dynamics. He noticed how the bikers' eyes lingered a little too long on the younger waitress, how their jokes carried an edge of intimidation, how the other customers seemed to shrink in their seats. When one of the bikers, accidentally, bumped into old Mr. Thompson, causing the elderly man to spill his coffee, the farmer's son felt his jaw tighten. The biker's mocking apology and his friend's laughter made something stir inside him, a familiar feeling he'd tried to leave behind in those far-off places. The situation escalated when the bikers discovered their preferred tables were reserved for the Sunday morning church crowd. Their leader, already irritated by what he perceived as small-town stuffiness, decided to make an example. He began removing the reserved signs, crumpling them one by one while staring challengingly at the nervous waitress. The farmer's son folded his newspaper carefully, placed it on the table, and took one last sip of his coffee. 6 years of training had taught him to read situations, to anticipate how they would unfold. He knew what would happen next. He'd seen it too many times before. The bikers would push until someone pushed back, and in a town like Pine Grove, nobody was prepared for that kind of confrontation. As he stood up, his movement caught the bikers' attention. They saw what everyone else saw, a young man in worn jeans and a faded work shirt, with the kind of quiet demeanor that made him easy to overlook. The leader smirked, probably already thinking of ways to intimidate this local boy who dared to stand up to them. What they didn't see was the way he moved, with the fluid economy of motion that came from years of special operations training. They didn't notice how he positioned himself in the room, maintaining perfect awareness of exits and angles. They had no way of knowing that beneath that humble exterior was a man who had led some of the most dangerous missions in recent military history. The next few moments would change everything in Pine Grove, though nobody could have predicted exactly how. The quiet farmer's son was about to remind everyone that appearances could be deceiving, and that true strength often came wrapped in the most unassuming packages. The morning sunlight filtered through the diner's windows, casting long rectangles of golden light across the checkered floor. In that illuminated dust-filled air, time seemed to slow down as the farmer's son took 3 measured steps forward. His boots made no sound on the worn linoleum, a habit ingrained from years of moving through environments where silence meant survival. The leader of the Thunder Raiders turned fully toward him now, his weathered face splitting into an amused grin. The other patrons watched with held breath as this unlikely scene unfolded before them. The hometown boy they'd known since childhood stood facing down a man twice his size, with a dozen leather-clad bikers backing him up. "Something on your mind, farm boy?" The leader's voice carried the gravelly texture of too many cigarettes and too many hard miles on the road. His fingers, adorned with heavy silver rings, drummed against the counter in a rhythm that matched the tension building in the room. The farmer's son's response came soft and steady, each word carefully chosen. "Those signs you're tearing up, they're for Mrs. Wilson's Sunday school group. Been meeting here every week for the past 30 years. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, never wavered from the leader's face. "Seems to me there's plenty of other tables available." A few of the bikers chuckled, the sound lacking any real humor. They began to spread out, unconsciously following tactical positioning they'd learned in bar fights across the country. What they didn't realize was that their target was noting every movement, calculating distances, analyzing angles, all with the precision of someone who had done this in scenarios where the stakes were life and death. The leader stepped closer, his boots heavy on the floor. The morning light caught the silver in his beard and the worn patches on his leather vest. "You know who we are, boy? The Thunder Raiders don't take kindly to being told where to sit." His voice dropped lower, meant to intimidate. "Especially not by some dirt farmer who doesn't know his place." The diner had gone completely silent. Even the usual sizzle from the grill seemed muted, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The waitress behind the counter had her hand on the phone, ready to call for help, though everyone knew the local sheriff was probably still finishing his morning coffee 3 towns over. "I know exactly who you are," the farmer's son replied, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several of the bikers shift uncomfortably. "And I know what you're trying to do here. But this isn't like other towns you've passed through. These are good people. Hardworking people. They deserve respect." Something in his tone, or perhaps something in his stance, made the leader pause. Years of running with rough crowds had given him an instinct for danger, and something about this unassuming young man was setting off warning bells he couldn't quite understand. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Outside, a flock of birds took flight from the old maple tree, their wings catching the morning light. Inside, the air grew thick with possibility. The farmer's son remained perfectly still, but those who looked closely might have noticed how his weight had shifted slightly, how his hands hung loose but ready at his sides. One of the younger bikers, perhaps eager to prove himself, made the first move. He stepped forward quickly, reaching out to grab the farmer's son's shirt. What happened next would be talked about in Pine Grove for years to come. The movement was almost too fast to follow. The farmer's son stepped into the grab, his hand moving in a precise arc that ended with the young biker flying through the air, landing with a crash on an empty table. The motion was smooth, efficient, and spoke of years of training. More importantly, it was controlled, designed to neutralize rather than harm. The other bikers froze, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty. Their leader's eyes narrowed as he began to reassess the situation. The young man before him hadn't moved from his spot, hadn't even raised his voice, but suddenly the air around him seemed charged with lethal potential. "Military?" the leader asked, his voice carrying a new note of respect. The farmer's son didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the positions of every biker, every civilian, every potential hazard. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Let's just say I've spent some time in places where you learn to handle yourself." A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The other diners, who had been watching in fear, now sat straighter in their seats. They'd always known him as the quiet boy who'd gone away to serve his country, but now they were seeing a different side of him, a glimpse of the man he'd become during those years away. The leader of the Thunder Raiders studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, he laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to release some of the tension in the room. "You've got steel in your spine, boy. Don't meet many like you these days." He gestured to his crew, who began to relax their stances. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here." The young biker who'd been thrown picked himself up, his face red with embarrassment but also showing a newfound respect. The farmer's son acknowledged him with a slight nod, a gesture that somehow managed to be both apologetic and warning at the same time. As the situation de-escalated, the morning light continued to pour through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like golden stars. The diner slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. The people of Pine Grove had seen something extraordinary, not just in the display of skill, but in the way their quiet neighbor had stood up for what was right while maintaining his dignity and control. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the rolling hills of Pine Grove when the Thunder Raiders roared back to life. Their motorcycles gleamed in the golden light as they prepared to leave town, but something unexpected happened. The leader, after a long conversation with his crew, made his way back to the Anderson farm, where the farmer's son was working in the fields. The sight of a leather-clad biker walking through rows of corn would have seemed comical if not for the gravity in his bearing. He found the young man fixing an irrigation system, hands deep in the earth that had sustained his family for generations. The contrast between them couldn't have been more stark, one man covered in road dust and leather, the other in soil and sweat. "Your technique back there," the leader began, his voice carrying across the field, "that wasn't just military. That was something else." He stopped a respectful distance away, watching as the farmer's son straightened up, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. "I served too, you know. 2 tours in Desert Storm. But what you did? That was SEAL work." The wind rustled through the cornfields, carrying with it the sweet scent of approaching evening. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and somewhere a meadowlark called out its evening song. The farmer's son remained quiet for a moment, looking out over the land that had called him back home after years of service in shadows. "Not here to cause trouble," the biker leader continued, raising his hands slightly. "Just wanted to understand something." "Why this?" He gestured at the farmland around them. "With your skills, you could be doing private security, making 6 figures easy. Instead, you're out here, working the same soil as your old man." The question hung in the air like the dust motes dancing in the dying sunlight. The farmer's son walked over to a nearby water pump, his movement still carrying that fluid grace that spoke of years of training. He took a drink, then offered the ladle to the biker, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "During my last deployment," the farmer's son finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memories, "we were in a village high up in the Hindu Kush. The locals there had these terraced fields, carved right into the mountainside. They'd been farming that land for centuries, growing food for their families, their community." He paused, his eyes distant. "One night, under a sky full of stars, an old farmer shared his bread with us. He didn't speak English, we didn't speak his language, but there was something in his eyes, pride in his land, in what he'd built." The biker leader listened intently, understanding dawning in his weathered features. Around them, the evening shadows lengthened, painting the farmland in shades of purple and gold. "That night, watching him tend his fields even after dark, I realized something," the farmer's son continued. "All the missions, all the combat skills, all the training, they were means to an end. They were about protecting something. Something real, something that matters." He ran his hand through a nearby cornstalk, feeling its strength. This land, these fields, the people in town, they're what I was fighting for all along. Being here, working this soil, I'm still protecting something. Just in a different way. The biker's expression softened, years of hard road miles seeming to fall away from his face. You remind me of my old man, he said quietly. Had a farm in Nebraska. Lost it in the '80s farm crisis. Never saw him cry except that day. The confession hung between them, a bridge of understanding built on shared respect for the land and the values it represented. In the distance, the other Thunder Raiders' motorcycles idled, waiting for their leader. Got a proposition for you, the biker said, shifting his weight. My crew and I, we do this charity run every year. Raising money for veterans' families. Usually have some trouble in small towns, people see the leather and chrome, they get nervous. He paused, looking directly at the farmer's son. Could use someone like you. Someone who understands both worlds. The farmer's son considered this, his eyes scanning the horizon where the last rays of sun painted the clouds in brilliant oranges and pinks. A flock of geese flew overhead in perfect formation, their calls echoing across the peaceful evening sky. Tell you what, he replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Next time you're passing through, stop by the diner. We'll talk about it over coffee. Mrs. Wilson's Sunday school group might even save you a table. The biker leader laughed, the sound rolling across the fields like distant thunder. He extended his hand, and the farmer's son shook it, a gesture that spoke of mutual respect earned through understanding rather than force. As the Thunder Raiders departed Pine Grove that evening, their engines echoing off the hills, the town felt different somehow. The regulars at the diner had witnessed more than just a confrontation that morning, they'd seen a bridge built between two worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. They'd seen how strength could be expressed through restraint, and how understanding could grow in the most unexpected places. The farmer's son returned to his evening chores, the familiar rhythm of farm life settling around him like a comfortable blanket. The skills that had made him lethal in combat now helped him mend fences and tend to sick animals. The awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territories now helped him read weather patterns and predict early frosts. The weeks that followed brought changes to Pine Grove as subtle as morning dew on grass. The story of the quiet confrontation at the diner had spread through the community like ripples in a still pond, transforming the way people saw the farmer's son. But it wasn't just his hidden strength that captured their attention, it was the grace with which he carried it. One misty morning, as dawn painted the sky in watercolor shades of pink and lavender, the farmer's son found himself helping old Mrs. Thompson with her broken-down truck. The elderly woman had been stranded on the side of the road, her ancient pickup refusing to start. As he worked under the hood, she spoke of her grandson, currently serving overseas. He writes about the desert stars, she said, her voice wavering slightly as she clutched a thermos of coffee. Says they're different there, brighter somehow. Like diamonds scattered on black velvet. She paused, studying the young man's face. You've seen them too, haven't you? He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, memories flooding back of nights spent in remote outposts, where the stars had indeed seemed close enough to touch. Yes, ma'am, he replied softly. They're like nothing else on earth. The morning mist swirled around them as he explained the problem with her truck, a simple fix, just a loose connection in the battery terminal. But the conversation had opened something in him, a small window into the world he'd left behind. Later that day, at the local hardware store, he encountered the sheriff, a man who had known him since he was a boy climbing apple trees in his mother's orchard. The older man was struggling with a stack of lumber, preparing for the town's annual harvest festival. Heard about what happened at the diner, the sheriff said, as they loaded the wood into his truck. Could have turned ugly. But you handled it just right. He paused, leaning against the truck's tailgate. Reminds me of your grandfather during the flood of '82. Never raised his voice, never lost his cool. Just knew exactly what needed doing and did it. The farmer's son listened, surprised by the comparison. He'd never known his grandfather, who'd passed away before he was born, but stories of the man's quiet strength had been woven into the fabric of his childhood. The conversation shifted to the upcoming festival, and soon the farmer's son found himself volunteered to help with the security arrangements. The sheriff's eyes twinkled with knowing wisdom. He understood that giving the young man a way to use his skills to protect the community might help him find his place in it again. As autumn approached, the farm's rhythms intensified with the coming harvest. One evening, while checking the far fields, he came across a group of local teenagers who had set up an impromptu camping site. Their faces showed momentary fear at being discovered, but he recognized them, the kids who helped out at the Sunday market, who played basketball in the church parking lot. Instead of sending them away, he sat with them for a while, teaching them how to build a proper campfire. As the flames cast dancing shadows on their faces, one of the boys asked about his service. The farmer's son was quiet for a moment, watching the sparks rise into the darkening sky. "There are things I can't talk about," he began carefully, "but I can tell you this, everything I learned out there taught me to appreciate what we have here even more." He gestured to the surrounding fields, the distant lights of homes, the peaceful countryside. "Some people spend their whole lives searching for what we've got right in this moment." The teenagers listened with rapt attention, seeing him in a new light. Here was someone who had seen the world, faced its dangers, and chosen to return to their small town. It gave them a different perspective on their own dreams and ambitions. The next morning, as he worked in the barn, his father joined him. They worked in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor. Finally, his father spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother and I," he began, pausing to gather his thoughts, "we worried every day you were gone. Not just about your safety, but about whether you'd come back to us. Whether the boy who left would return." He picked up a pitchfork, its tines gleaming in the barn's dim light. "But watching you these past months, seeing how you found your way back to the land, to the community. I understand now. You never really left. You just had to go away to find your way back home." The words hung in the air like morning mist, full of unspoken love and understanding. Outside, a rooster crowed, announcing another day in Pine Grove. The farmer's son felt something settle in his chest, a peace he'd been searching for since his return. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the farmland, he stood at the edge of their property. The autumn wind carried the scent of ripening apples and freshly cut hay. In the distance, church bells rang for evening service, their sound carrying across the valley like a gentle reminder of community and belonging. He thought about the Thunder Raiders, about Mrs. Thompson's grandson under desert stars, about the teenagers around the campfire. Each interaction, each moment of connection, was helping him weave his two worlds together, the warrior he had become and the farmer he had always been. The harvest festival arrived with the first hints of autumn color painting the surrounding hills. Pine Grove transformed itself, with strings of lights crisscrossing Main Street and the smell of caramel apples and cinnamon floating on the crisp October air. The farmer's son found himself at the center of the preparations, his military precision proving invaluable in organizing the town's biggest annual celebration. Dawn broke over the festival grounds, the early morning light catching the dew on pumpkins arranged in neat rows. He'd been up since before sunrise, checking the security measures he'd helped design. The sheriff had given him free rein, and he'd approached the task with the same thoroughness he'd once applied to mission planning, though this time the objective was ensuring children could safely enjoy hayrides and carnival games. As he made his final rounds, he caught sight of a familiar rumble in the distance. The Thunder Raiders were returning, true to their word about the charity run. Their chrome-clad machines gleamed in the morning sun as they rolled into town, but this time there was no tension in the air, only anticipation. The biker leader dismounted near the festival entrance, removing his sunglasses to take in the scene. His crew had brought with them a convoy of supplies, everything from medical equipment to winter clothes, all destined for veteran families in need. The sight of leather-clad bikers unloading boxes of donations alongside town volunteers painted a picture of unity that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "Quite a setup you've got here," the leader remarked, approaching the farmer's son with an appreciative nod. "Your work?" He gestured to the well-organized layout of the festival grounds, where every detail had been considered, from emergency exits to first aid stations. "The whole town pitched in," came the modest reply, though both men knew the planning behind it carried the hallmark of special operations training, attention to detail that could only come from experience in high-stakes situations. As the day progressed, the festival grounds filled with families from Pine Grove and surrounding communities. Children darted between game booths, their laughter mixing with the music from the local high school band. The Thunder Raiders had set up their own booth, where they were selling raffle tickets for their charity drive, their tough exteriors softening as they handed out candy to wide-eyed kids. In the afternoon, the farmer's son found himself giving an impromptu demonstration at the climbing wall that had been set up for the children. What started as a simple safety check turned into a lesson on technique and trust. Parents watched in amazement as he guided nervous children through their fears, his patient voice and steady presence helping them find courage they didn't know they had. "You've got a gift with the little ones," observed Mrs. Wilson, who had paused in her duties at the pie judging table to watch. "Reminds me of how you used to help the younger kids with their 4-H projects, before you went away." Her eyes crinkled with warmth. "Some things don't change, do they?" The observation struck him deeply. In his years of service, he'd led men through some of the most challenging situations imaginable, but here, helping a small girl find her next handhold while her parents watched nervously below, he was using those same leadership skills in a completely different way. As evening approached, the festival lights came on, transforming the grounds into a magical landscape of warm golden glows and dancing shadows. The Thunder Raiders had integrated seamlessly into the celebration, their presence adding an unexpected dimension to the traditional small-town gathering. One of them, a younger member with sleeve tattoos visible beneath his leather jacket, was helping at the face-painting station, carefully drawing butterflies on children's cheeks with surprisingly delicate skill. The farmer's son found a quiet moment to step away, climbing to the small hill overlooking the festival. From this vantage point, he could see everything: the swirling lights, the moving crowds, the mix of leather jackets and flannel shirts as bikers and townspeople mingled freely. The sight filled him with a profound sense of satisfaction, different from but somehow equal to what he'd felt after successful missions. The biker leader joined him on the hill, offering a cup of Mrs. Thompson's famous apple cider. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the celebration below. In the distance, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. "You know," the leader began, his voice thoughtful, "when I first saw you in that diner, I thought I had you figured out. Quiet farm boy," in over his head. He chuckled, shaking his head. "But watching you these past few days, how you move, how you plan, how you lead without making it obvious you're leading, it reminds me of the best commanders I served under." The farmer's son listened, sipping his cider, as the leader continued. "But what impresses me most isn't your training or your skills. It's how you found a way to use them here, in peace. That's something a lot of us struggle with." Below them, the festival was reaching its peak. The local band had started playing, and couples were dancing on the makeshift floor near the bandstand. The sight of Thunder Raiders teaching local grandmothers to line dance would have seemed absurd a few months ago, but now it felt perfectly natural. "Sometimes the hardest battles," the farmer's son replied, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the evening air, "are the ones we fight with ourselves. Finding our place, our purpose, when the mission changes." He gestured to the scene below. "But maybe that's what it's all about, using what we learned out there to build something here." As autumn deepened into winter, Pine Grove settled into a peaceful rhythm, like a slow heartbeat beneath the blanket of early snow. The Harvest Festival had changed something in the town's dynamics, creating connections that ran deeper than anyone had expected. The farmer's son found himself at the center of this subtle transformation, though he would have been the last to claim any credit for it. One frosty morning, while checking the farm's winter preparations, he received an unexpected call. The Thunder Raiders had been coordinating with local veterans groups, and they'd identified a family in need just 3 counties over. A young veteran, struggling with the transition back to civilian life, was at risk of losing his small ranch. The story hit close to home, echoing through the chambers of memory like footsteps in an empty hall. The farmer's son stood in the barn doorway, watching his breath form clouds in the cold air as he listened to the details. Around him, the farm was quiet save for the occasional lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through bare branches. His father appeared silently beside him, reading the situation in his son's expression with the intuition that comes from years of shared understanding. "Go," his father said simply, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. "The farm will keep." The words carried the weight of wisdom, of knowing that some calls must be answered, even when they come from unexpected quarters. The drive to the struggling ranch took him through landscapes that seemed painted in shades of winter white and gray. The Thunder Raiders had already gathered there, their bikes looking almost out of place against the rural backdrop, like black ravens perched on a snow-covered fence. The young veteran's situation was worse than described: broken equipment, unpaid bills, and the hollow look in his eyes that the farmer's son recognized all too well. What happened over the next few days would become another story whispered in local diners and around warm fireplaces. The farmer's son took charge with the quiet efficiency that had become his trademark, but this time he was leading a different kind of mission. Local farmers, hearing of the situation through the grapevine, began arriving with equipment and supplies. The Thunder Raiders worked alongside them, their leather jackets exchanged for work gloves and heavy coats. The young veteran's wife watched from their porch, holding their infant daughter, as strangers became allies in their fight to save their home. Her husband, initially resistant to accepting help, found himself working shoulder to shoulder with men who understood his struggles without needing them explained. The farmer's son saw in him a reflection of his own earlier battles, the challenge of finding solid ground when the world seemed to shift beneath your feet. Late one evening, as the work crew was finishing up, the young veteran approached the farmer's son. They stood in the gathering dusk, frost beginning to crystallize on fence posts around them, their breath visible in the cold air. "How did you do it?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "How did you find your way back?" The farmer's son was quiet for a moment, watching the last traces of sunset paint the clouds in delicate shades of rose and violet. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I had to learn that strength isn't just about fighting," he said. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to accept help, about finding purpose in the small things, about building something instead of being ready to destroy." He gestured to the ranch around them, where signs of renewal were already visible. "The skills we learned out there, the discipline, the attention to detail, the ability to adapt, they're still valuable here. Just in different ways." As if to emphasize his point, a flock of geese passed overhead, their V-formation a reminder of nature's own military precision. The young veteran watched them until they disappeared into the darkening sky, something shifting in his expression. The next morning brought more volunteers, including several of Mrs. Wilson's Sunday school students, who had organized a bake sale to raise funds for the ranch. The sight of leather-clad bikers carefully carrying boxes of homemade cookies and pies added another layer of surreal beauty to the scene. The farmer's son found himself working alongside the biker leader, repairing a crucial piece of equipment. Their conversation turned to the changes they'd seen in themselves and others over the past months. "You know what I've learned," the leader mused, his hands steady as they worked. "The road teaches you to expect the unexpected, but sometimes the biggest surprises come when you stop moving." He paused, looking around at the diverse group working together. "Like finding brotherhood in a place you least expected it." As the day progressed, the young veteran's ranch began to show signs of revival. Equipment hummed back to life under skilled hands, broken fences stood straight again, and the heavy cloud of despair that had hung over the property began to lift. But more importantly, connections were being forged, between veterans and civilians, bikers and farmers, past and present. In the late afternoon, the young veteran's wife came out with their daughter, now wrapped warmly against the cold. The little girl was passed from arm to arm, bringing smiles to weather-worn faces and softening hard edges. Even the toughest-looking raiders melted at her innocent laughter. The farmer's son watched this scene unfold, feeling a deep sense of rightness settle in his chest. Here was another kind of mission, another way to serve, another battle worth fighting. The skills that had once made him a formidable warrior were now being used to build, to heal, to connect. As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted fields, he realized that perhaps this was what he had been training for all along, not just to protect, but to build bridges between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. In the gathering darkness, headlights and work lights created a warm glow around the ranch, like a beacon of hope in the winter landscape. Spring arrived in Pine Grove like a watercolor painting coming to life, each day adding new strokes of color to the landscape. The farmer's son watched as the last patches of snow melted away, revealing the first tender shoots of green beneath. The past winter had changed more than just the land, it had transformed the very fabric of the community in ways no one could have predicted. The diner, once the scene of that pivotal confrontation, had become a gathering place for an unlikely alliance. Sunday mornings now saw Thunder Raiders sitting alongside church groups, sharing coffee and conversation. Mrs. Wilson had even started reserving an extra table for any riders passing through, her initial wariness replaced by grandmotherly concern about whether they were eating enough. Word had spread about what happened at the young veterans' ranch, and similar stories began emerging from neighboring counties. The farmer's son found himself at the heart of an informal network of veterans helping veterans, with the Thunder Raiders serving as unexpected ambassadors between different worlds. His quiet strength had become a bridge, connecting those who had served with those who wanted to help but hadn't known how. One particularly beautiful spring morning, he was working in the newly plowed fields when a familiar rumble of motorcycles approached the farm. The biker leader had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a group of veterans from across the state, their bikes gleaming in the morning sun. Among them was the young ranch owner they'd helped during the winter, his face now showing the confidence of a man who had found his footing. They gathered in the barn, where morning light filtered through old boards in golden shafts. The leader explained their purpose: they wanted to formalize what had naturally developed over the past months. A foundation, he proposed, combining the Thunder Raiders network with local farming communities, creating a support system for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. "We've got bikes and attitude," the leader said with a grin, "and you've got roots and respect. Together, maybe we can help more of our brothers find their way home." The sunlight caught the silver in his beard as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of purpose. The farmer's son listened, feeling the familiar tension between staying in the background and stepping forward when needed. His father, who had quietly joined them, spoke up first. "Our barn could use some work," he said, gesturing to the weathered structure around them. "Might make a good meeting place, if we fixed it up right." The offer was more than just about space, it was an acknowledgement of something bigger taking root in their community. The next few weeks saw the barn's transformation become a community project. Local craftsmen worked alongside bikers and veterans, their different skills complementing each other in unexpected ways. The farmer's son found himself once again leading by example, his quiet efficiency setting the pace for others. One afternoon, while taking a break from the renovation, he sat with the young ranch owner on the newly built porch overlooking the fields. Spring wheat swayed in the breeze like waves on a green ocean, and in the distance, the mountains stood guard under a sky scattered with cottonwool clouds. "You know what I realized," the young veteran said, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. "When I came back, I thought I had to choose between who I was over there and who I needed to be here. But watching you, working with everyone these past months, I understand now. It's not about choosing, it's about building something new from everything we've learned." The farmer's son nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. In the fields below, his father was teaching some of the Thunder Raiders' younger members about soil composition and crop rotation. The sight would have seemed absurd a year ago, but now it felt perfectly natural. As spring progressed, the barn project neared completion. The old structure had been reinvented while keeping its character, much like the veterans it would serve. Large windows had been added to let in natural light, but the original beams remained, carrying the marks and memories of generations. The day they officially opened the Veteran Center, people came from all over the region. Bikes lined the driveway like a chrome and steel honor guard, their riders mingling with farmers in coveralls and families carrying potluck dishes. Mrs. Wilson had outdone herself with pies, and the young veteran's wife had brought their daughter, now taking her first wobbly steps in the spring grass. The farmer's son stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold. The biker leader found him there, and they shared a moment of quiet observation. "You know what's really beautiful about all this?" the leader said, gesturing to the gathering. "It's not just about helping veterans. It's about showing people that strength comes in different forms. That the skills that make a warrior valuable in combat can make a community stronger in peace." As if to emphasize his point, they watched as a group of veterans helped set up tables, their movements unconsciously coordinated, their training showing in how efficiently they worked together. Nearby, some of the Thunder Raiders were entertaining children with stories, their tough exteriors softening in the face of young curiosity. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farm as people gathered for the official ceremony. The farmer's son had been asked to speak, something he would have declined a year ago. But standing before this diverse group, bikers, veterans, farmers, townspeople, he found the words coming naturally. "This barn," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "has stood here for 3 generations. It's weathered storms, sheltered harvests, and held the dreams of my family. Now it's going to serve a new purpose, but the core remains the same. It's still about protection, about nurturing growth, about building something that lasts." A year had passed since that first confrontation in the diner, and Pine Grove had bloomed into something extraordinary. The summer evening air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut hay and wild honeysuckle as people gathered at the Anderson farm for what had become a monthly tradition. The renovated barn, now a thriving veteran center, glowed with warm light as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The farmer's son stood at the edge of the gathering, taking in the scene before him. Thunder Raiders' motorcycles lined the gravel driveway, their chrome catching the golden hour light like flames. Children played between the bikes without fear, their laughter mixing with the sound of acoustic guitar coming from the barn's open doors. Inside, veterans both young and old shared stories and support, while outside, families spread blankets on the grass for an impromptu picnic. Mrs. Thompson was there, proudly showing everyone pictures of her grandson, now safely home from his deployment. The young ranch owner they'd helped during the winter was teaching a group of interested bikers about sustainable farming practices, his daughter toddling behind him wearing a tiny leather jacket, a gift from the Thunder Raiders. The biker leader approached, 2 cups of Mrs. Wilson's famous lemonade in hand. They found a quiet spot on the new wooden bench overlooking the wheat fields, which rippled like a golden ocean in the evening breeze. "Remember that morning in the diner?" the leader asked, passing over one of the cups. "Never would have guessed we'd end up here." He gestured to the scene before them, where leather-clad bikers were helping set up tables for dinner alongside local farmers in their work clothes. The farmer's son smiled, memories of that tense morning floating back like autumn leaves on a gentle wind. "Life has a way of surprising you," he replied, watching as his father demonstrated proper tomato planting techniques to a group of veterans interested in starting their own gardens. "You know what really gets me?" the leader continued, his voice thoughtful. "We came to this town looking for trouble, and instead, we found purpose. The boys have never been more committed to anything than they are to this veteran support network we've built together. Inside the barn, the walls now held photos and memorabilia, not just from military service, but from the community they'd built. Pictures of Thunder Raiders helping with the harvest, veterans teaching local kids about motorcycle maintenance, farmers and bikers working side by side to help struggling families. Each image told a story of bridges built and barriers broken. The young veteran's wife appeared, carrying a fresh apple pie. "Hot from the oven," she announced, setting it down nearby. "Mrs. Wilson's been teaching me her secrets." The transformation in her was evident. Gone was the worried young woman they'd met at the struggling ranch. In her place stood someone confident, part of a community that had her back. As evening settled in, more people arrived for the monthly gathering. The sheriff, who'd once worried about the Thunder Raiders' presence in town, was now a regular attendee, often bringing his famous barbecue ribs. He'd come to understand that sometimes the most effective peacekeeping happened not through force, but through connection. The farmer's son excused himself and walked to the old oak tree at the edge of the property. Its branches stretched toward the darkening sky like fingers reaching for stars just beginning to appear. Below it, he'd built a small memorial, a simple stone marker honoring fallen comrades. It had become a place of quiet reflection for veterans who visited the center. As he stood there, the biker leader's words from a year ago echoed in his mind. "You've got steel in your spine, boy." Back then, it had been about strength in confrontation. Now, he understood it was about something deeper, the strength to build bridges, to heal wounds, to create something lasting. The sound of motorcycles approaching drew his attention. A new group of veterans had arrived, having heard about the center through the growing network. He watched as they were immediately welcomed into the fold. Thunder Raiders helping with their bikes, farmers offering fresh produce, other veterans stepping forward with understanding in their eyes. Mrs. Wilson appeared beside him, her gentle presence a reminder of how far they'd all come. "You know," she said, looking out over the gathering, "when I first saw those bikers in my diner, I thought it was the end of something. Turns out it was just the beginning." The farmer's son nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The confrontation that could have torn the community apart had instead become its foundation. The skills he'd learned as a SEAL, leadership, adaptability, precision, had found new purpose in building peace instead of preparing for war. As night fell, someone started a bonfire in the designated pit near the barn. People gathered around it, the flames casting dancing shadows on faces that no longer saw differences in clothing or background. Veterans shared stories with civilians who listened with newfound understanding. Thunder Raiders taught local teens about motorcycle maintenance while farmers discussed crop rotation with interested bikers. Looking at the scene, the farmer's son felt a deep sense of completion. The mission he'd been training for all his life wasn't just about combat skills or military precision. It was about building something stronger than any single person, a community where everyone's strengths contributed to the whole. His father joined him at the oak tree, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. Together, they watched as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars he'd once watched from distant battlefields. But now they felt different, not like distant observers of conflict, but like bright promises of hope. "You've done good, son," his father said simply, the words carrying the weight of generations of Anderson farmers who had worked this land. "You've helped grow something here that's going to last." The farmer's son looked out over their land, at the barn that had become a beacon of hope, at the diverse group of people who had become family, at the bridges built between worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. He understood now that true strength wasn't just about the battles you fought, but about the peace you helped create. As the evening wound down, with fireflies beginning their dance over the fields and the moon rising like a silver dollar in the purple sky, he knew that his greatest mission had been accomplished. Not through force or confrontation, but through understanding, patience, and the quiet strength that had always been his trademark. The Thunder Raiders would ride out again, but they would always return. The veterans would find their way here, to this place of healing and hope. And the quiet farmer's son would continue his work, tending not just to the land, but to the community that had grown as surely as the crops in his fields.